All right, well, what is up, Grove Youth? We're so excited to be joining you today. Tonight we're going to be kicking off a new series called Spiral. And the whole idea of it is, how to lean into God when life seems to be spiraling out of control. This series is really aimed at addressing mental health. Now, mental health is a big topic that I know comes up a lot inside of social media and culture today, but it is something that the church and our God in heaven, He's got something to say about it. And so over the next few weeks, we're going to be addressing different topics of mental health, what it is, what it isn't, what God has to say about it, how to know if you're struggling with it, how to know if someone you love or know is struggling with it, and also how we can fight and how we can have even victory inside of this area of life too. So we're really pumped to jump into this new series today. Today joining us, we have some guests. The first one is...
Hi, I'm Olivia.
That's right, Olivia. Why don't you tell us a little about yourself, where you go to school, things like that.
I'm a senior in high school. I go to Woodcrest Christian, and I'm excited to be here today.
Heck yeah, we're excited to have you. It's going to be great. And then joining us from the more professional side, we've got...
Hi, I'm Trey. I'm one of the pastors here, and I'm also the director of our counseling center.
That's right. Trey's awesome. We love having him, and he's going to really be driving this conversation. So you're going to really want to pay attention to what he's got to say, okay? It'll be good. Well, as we jump into this, let me go ahead and pray. Father, thank you for this chance that we get to be together and really address this topic of mental health. God, I pray that throughout this series, Lord, that our students, our leaders, whoever's watching this, that they would feel just the nudging that they need in their hearts, Lord, to address this topic themselves. That it wouldn't be something that's shied away from, but that, Lord, you would really open up our hearts and our minds to the truth in this topic, and that it would transform us, the truth, and set us free from maybe some of the things that the world has told us about it. So God, I pray that you would be with the people speaking tonight, with Olivia, with Trey, with myself, that we wouldn't have any nerves, that we would really just be speaking the words that you want us to speak. We love you, Lord, so much. In your name we pray, amen. Well, Trey, there's all kinds of talk about mental health. Why don't we start off with, what is it really?
So in general, mental health issues are disorders that are dealing with your mood, your thinking, or your behavior. It's one of those things where it can be either of those, it can be all of those, but it has to cause a problem in your daily functioning. It could be a problem at school, it could be a problem at home, a problem with your friends, and usually it's going to cause problems in more than one of those areas. And so you've got this condition, and it really just gets in the way of your thinking, dealing with your feelings, your processing things, and how you respond to others. So people are going to notice that because you're not thinking clearly, you're not dealing with them in the same way that you used to, and those kinds of things. There are about 4 kind of things that lead into mental illness. The first one is physical stuff. A lot goes on in your brain. There are neurotransmitters that fire back and forth, and you have problems with those. Your hormone levels can be off, brain abnormalities, all kinds of things that are physical issues. There's also a trauma and abuse history can feed into all kinds of mental illness. What happens is when you go through something that's traumatic, even the way your brain processes things changes. There can also be a series of ineffective coping or negative behavior patterns. You just kind of get stuck in a rut doing things that aren't good and that you shouldn't be doing.
Gotcha.
And then there's also spiritual causes. Sometimes our sin causes mental illness. It's one of those things that a lot of people don't like dealing with that part of it, and a lot of shame comes with that part of it. But what happens is sin separates us from God. And when we're separated from God, we have this void inside of us. And we want to fill that void because we don't like how it feels without God. I mean, we've got a space in our heart for Him. When He's not there, things get messed up. So then what that does is then that can lead to depression, that can lead to more anxiety, it can lead to acting out behaviors to try to fill that with things that don't fit there very well.
Gotcha.
So when you look at those 4 things, ADHD is a good way to kind of look at how it may be more than one of them at the same time.
What is ADHD?
So ADHD
I've forgotten.
is a lot of things that is one of those things a lot of people at school might have.
Okay.
But it's the difficulty concentrating and being overly active, overly fidgeting. And it just gets in the way of learning, gets in the way of being able to focus on something.
Gotcha, okay.
And what happens is you've got a body part of that. You've got your brain having trouble thinking. So you're not able to concentrate, or like everything going around distracts you. You're way overly distracted. So you've got thinking issues, you've got your body wanting to move all the time. Your body just doesn't want to stop. You have trouble, you want to get up, move around.
Gotcha.
Now, when you look at ADHD, You also might look that way if you're struggling with sin and you're feeling guilty and you're wanting to hide it. It might look the same, but it doesn't mean that that's a mental illness. It just means that's your struggle with needing to deal with sin. God kind of brings us to those things that we need to deal with. And when we need to deal with them, He makes us uncomfortable.
Gotcha.
So, but then what happens is, as you're feeling guilty, then you might be depressed. You might be more anxious. You might be more worried about things. So that might actually come back around and cause some mental illness. So when you're looking at it, it's all kind of convoluted sometimes because it all impacts each other and it all gets kind of messed up together. Now, one of the things to remember about mental illness is it's way more common than you might think it is. In general, in any given year, 1 in 5 adults has some form of mental illness.
Wow.
And you think, wow, that's a lot. Well, that's twice as much as would have diabetes, 5 times as many as would have cancer. So it's pretty prevalent. It's way more prevalent than you would think. And when you look at adolescents, over 20% of the people watching this today will have some form of mental illness by the time they reach adulthood. So it's one of those things, if you think about it, you get 4 friends, that's 5 of you. One of that group, statistically, would have some kind of struggle with that. But it's not like other people aren't having that struggle. There's some pretty famous people. Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, Isaac Newton, Abraham Lincoln, Winston Churchill, Albert Einstein, all had mental illness. And it hits Christians too. C.S. Lewis, Mother Teresa, both struggled with mental illness.
Wow.
When you were in high school, did you have any friends that struggled with mental illness?
I did. One of my good friends, Nikki, a friend brought her to our youth group. That's how I got to know her, as a friend of a friend. And, we got to spend some time together. And the more I got to know her, the more I saw that she just saw herself as worthless. That was the biggest thing about her. She just believed she was worthless. And I got to know her better, and it didn't go away. It didn't change. Now, she did have things to worry about in her life. She had an abusive family and a really rough time with that. But when we would talk about all of her worry, it wasn't about that. It was about everything. Everything she thought about, she would turn into a worry. And she totally felt not good enough for anything. She would describe herself as feeling sad and trapped. And I remember we finally talked her into going to camp with us, and it was great. I remember the afternoon we sat down and she was like, I really want to accept Christ into my life. And I prayed the prayer with her, and it was a neat transformation, and she changed a lot, but it didn't take away her anxiety or her depression. And so we had to kind of deal with that. And she didn't want me to tell anyone what was going on. And she told me that I was the only one she had told. And I was like, well, wait, your best friend brought you to our youth group here and you haven't told her? And she's like, no, don't tell her. Whatever you do, don't tell her. She didn't want anyone to know. And then one of the things that was hard to watch is she got this boyfriend, and he was just a real jerk. Horrible jerk. He treated her horribly, kept pushing her to have sex, and finally she did. And then she felt even worse. She felt even more worthless, even more used. So it was just a really big struggle, and she finally got some help. I finally talked her into going and getting some counseling, and she did, and things slowly got better. But she never got over that stigma of that it made her not good enough. She would never want anyone to tell. She never got past that.
Which is hard. I think a lot of people I know, they struggle with that. It's just like, okay, wait, I have to go ask for something like that. It's going to be viewed. Even though culture is shifting in it, it's still something that's different, and that stigma's still there often.
Yeah, definitely.
Wow.
What are some of the biggest stigmas around mental health?
So in general, stigma is just something that disapproves and shames. So there are a whole lot of different things, because what happens is you're attaching meaning to mental illness that doesn't belong there. Some of the biggest ones are, they're crazy, they're violent, they must be dangerous, or they're weak, they're less than, they've got to just be lazy, or they're just not trying hard enough. Their faith isn't good enough. They're broken. What did they do wrong to be that way? So all kinds of different things. Sure. So Olivia, have you had some experience with seeing some stigma in people that you know?
Yeah, for sure. I think one of the biggest stigmas about mental health and mental illness is Usually people's first reactions whenever they hear about someone struggling with mental illness is they automatically assume the worst case scenario. They automatically assume the most extreme example, which honestly isn't the case most of the time. And so they end up kind of psyching themselves into thinking that there's no way that they can be good enough to help this person, because they just trick themselves into thinking that the situation is too big for them to handle. And I think in that case, it is mind over matter. I think you really need to just think about how Jesus treated people while he was on earth, and about how he didn't let things make him uncomfortable. We saw he healed a leper. We saw he did all of these things that in the culture of the time were very stigmatized, and he really went against those stigmas and the cultural norms to help people. And I think that we need to reflect Jesus' character like that, and just push against what our human nature tells us to do as a result of the fall, and just to empathize with other people.
For sure. That's a
Definitely.
good word.
Absolutely.
Wow.
You know,
Good stuff, Olivia.
9 out of 10 people that have mental illness really feel like the stigma is a problem for them and that it negatively impacts their life. So it's a huge issue. And it's not a new thing, like you were talking about some of the stigma in the Bible. In John 9, Jesus kind of argues against one of the main stigmas of the time. The disciples came to him, and there was a man that was blind since birth. And so they were like, Jesus, was it his sin or his parents' sin? So their stigma was that somebody sinned, that's why he's blind. Yeah. And so Jesus basically was like, that's the wrong question. When he responded, he was like, no, it's neither. It's neither. Why are you making it about that? So even that way old stigma that was there in Jesus' time, he was like, no, that's not how we need to treat this. That's not how we need to do with it. Because stigma brings about shame. And shame is like, the best picture of shame is going back to the Garden of Eden, right after original sin. Right. Adam and Eve hiding in the bushes, grabbing fig leaves to cover their naked bodies. That's that feeling of shame. I've got to cover this up. I've got to hide. I can't have it seen. And so stigma brings about that level of shame. Yeah,
for sure. And that's I think we experience that in all different areas of life where there's another sin, but man, that's something that we struggle with. So with that, I mean, it brings up this question: if you feel shame after sin, like, does that mean that it's a sin to struggle with these mental health things, anxiety, depression, things like that?
That's a great question, and for such a straightforward question, it really gets so many people arguing.
I can imagine.
But when you're looking at it, one of the problems is the Bible doesn't have this concept of mental illness. It's not a concept that was in that culture at that time, so you can't expect the Bible to say, love the person with major depressive disorder. It just doesn't happen.
Right.
Because they didn't know what that was. They didn't think of it that way. So when you're looking at that, you have to look at that it's not a sin to have a mental illness, but it is a result of sin, the original sin. Mental illness came into the world with the fall. Before there was sin, Adam and Eve lived in the garden and it was perfect. After sin, after they get kicked out of the garden, a lot of things come. Pain in childbirth, difficulty growing things in the fields, but also illness came in. Sure. And mental illness with that came in. So it's a result of the fall. And in 2 Corinthians it says, therefore we do not lose heart, though outwardly we are wasting away, yet inwardly we are being renewed day by day. It's that, our bodies aren't what they should be because of sin. They're wasting away as God is renewing the inside of us. So in looking at this, we're dealing with that mental illness is a result of original sin, but not a result of our sin now. But on the flip side of that, it may lead us to sin. Wow. Our frustration or our symptoms can make us blame and hate other people, blame and hate God, use drugs or alcohol, or like my friend Nikki, throw sex in to try to make things feel better. So it can lead us to sin, but it's not because we sinned.
So I know how you said in the Bible it doesn't particularly mention mental illness by name, and there's no direct verses that really deal with that. So would you say that mental illness is a new thing, or why do you think that it isn't explicitly mentioned in the Bible?
I don't think it's a new thing. I think our label for it is a new thing.
Gotcha.
We've developed psychology, this study of who we are, It's really a study of how God made us and what God made us to be.
Right.
But as we're studying that, we're calling things things. It makes it easier for us to deal with them. They had labels for them back then that were just different than our labels now.
Gotcha.
Follow-up question. Is it a sin to take medicine for anxiety and depression?
It's a great question. The answer is no, it's not a sin. It also doesn't show a lack of faith. So many people go to this place where they're just like, oh, you just don't have enough faith. You're
That's
trying
huge.
medicine.
Yeah.
And it's not that, you know. And for those people to say that to them was a real slam on their faith, you know, to be able to say that. But what happens is as you take medicine, it clears up your thinking and it helps you experience God better. So it helps your relationship with God grow. It doesn't get in the way of it, and it's not a lack of faith. So one of the things, too, is that in the context of treating mental illness, the best thing you can do is this combination of medication and counseling. Either alone is not as good as both together.
Gotcha. Which sometimes it's going to require that, and sometimes counseling alone would help, but rarely do you see like medicine being just like, oh, just medicating and it's fine. It's like, oh my, that always does better paired with counseling, which makes huge sense. I mean, this whole topic that we're talking about really is, it comes down to spiritual warfare, and in a certain sense, that is a question I always hear is like, okay, well, like the negative thoughts that I struggle with, are they from myself, or is this the enemy putting these thoughts on me? So, I mean, that's the question. How does spiritual warfare play a role in this?
Okay, great question. In general, your thoughts come from within you. The exception is psychotic disorders. When someone is psychotic, they're seeing things that aren't there, they're believing things that aren't true, they're thinking things that are coming out of their illness, not out of them.
Gotcha.
So with that particular case, those thoughts really aren't yours. And medication is a big part of it, and counseling to help you figure out those aren't your thoughts and they're not real is huge. But outside of that, the thoughts you have are yours. Now, those thoughts are influenced by other things. They may be influenced by your depression, they may be influenced by your anxiety, they're influenced by your friends and family, definitely. And the enemy can influence those thoughts. John 8:44 says Satan is the father of lies. He can't read our thoughts, but he doesn't want us to think good thoughts about ourselves. So there is a spiritual aspect of that. So when you start talking about feeling worthless, he's going to jump on that and really try to make you feel that way.
You're worthless, you're terrible.
Absolutely.
And try to get you to believe that lie.
So there is a spiritual warfare component of it. It just may not be what you initially were thinking it would be. And in 2 Corinthians 10:5 it says, we demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God, and we take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ. So whatever is influencing our thoughts, we need to run it through our Jesus filter. You know, we need to look at, is that a true thought? Is that not a true thought? Does it line up with the Bible? So when you start bringing that in, it's an incredible tool to be able to say, wow, my friends are telling me this about me. Is that true?
Yeah.
Is it not true? Those are important things to ask about your thoughts.
It's huge.
I think going back to what I asked you earlier, I like how you said how even though in the Bible mental illness isn't explicitly mentioned, it still is present. Like Solomon said, like there's nothing new under the sun. Going off of that, would you say that there's any specific cases in the Bible where we see people struggling with mental illness where it maybe isn't addressed as mental illness specifically?
Absolutely. There definitely are. When you think about Elijah, he was dealing with Jezebel. It was weighing on him. He had this wonderful experience with the prophets of Baal, but then he goes out into the desert just wanting to die. So something was going wrong. His thinking was off. His feelings were off. So yes, that's a pretty clear picture. The same thing happened with Jonah, where he goes and sits outside of Nineveh and is just like, I'm going to sit here till I die, Lord. And God has to interact with him and deal with that with him. And you also look at Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane.
It's a big one.
He does a great thing. He takes his friends with him. That's a good thing. You know, when you're struggling, friends are important. But he gets out there and he is so worried and anxious, he even sweats blood. So that's some pretty serious kind of anxiety. Now, he's got a really big issue that he's dealing with, a really big calling. So it fits, but it's still anxiety. And so Hebrews 2:7 says, For this reason, he had to be made like them, fully human in every way, in order that he might become merciful and a faithful high priest in service to God, and that he might make atonement for the sins of the people. Because he himself suffered when he was tempted, he is able to help those who are being tempted. So he knows what it feels like to be human, to be on earth, to go through all those things.
Yeah.
He knows what it feels like to have sinned because he took on all of our sin.
Right.
So then all of a sudden we've got someone who knows what we're thinking, what it's like, what we're going through. So it's not that he can't relate.
And that's like one of the most freeing things. I think that's what I love personally, even about counseling. The times I've seen counselors is when I'm talking about things and they're not just saying, "Oh wow, what a weirdo," but instead they're like saying, "Yeah, I see that in life. I can understand that." It's just that feeling of, "Oh my gosh, like that's amazing that you can understand that." So it's even more beautiful when you can look at our Savior and say, "Wow, God, you get this. This isn't a surprise to you. It's not a shock. It reminds you of God's character, of His all-knowingness." And I know that gives me a ton of hope. It reminds me of John 16:33. Jesus says in the garden, "I've told you these things that in me you may have peace. In this world you have trouble, but take heart. I have overcome the world," which is really just where even that verse in Hebrews 2, it comes out of that truth, that knowledge that He's already taken these things on.
Yeah.
But in life, it talks about in 1 Peter 4:12-13, "Dear friends, do not be surprised at the fiery ordeal that has come on you to test you, as though something strange were happening to you. But rejoice inasmuch as you participate in the sufferings of Christ, so that you may be overjoyed when His glory is revealed." So, my question from that is this part of the suffering that we're talking about in 1 Peter 4:12 that is promised to us as followers of Christ, to share in His sufferings and become more like Him?
It's a great question. In the U.S., we tend to believe that all suffering is bad.
For sure, right?
Like, go take a Tylenol for it.
Yeah, right.
We've got a bigger painkiller if you need a bigger painkiller. But when you think about it, pain is not all bad. You wouldn't blink if your eyes didn't dry out and give you a little pain.
It's true.
That's what makes you blink.
Yeah.
So there's a function to pain, and we tend to ignore that. And so, like, if you take all these painkillers and you don't notice that you've got a big thorn in your foot and you just keep walking on it, you're going to make it worse.
Right.
So you can't take pain's function away. So God has this different picture of pain. In Romans 5, it talks about that suffering brings about perseverance, character, and character, hope in the glory of God.
Yeah.
So it's like this different picture of suffering than we go. You don't talk about, man, how's your suffering been lately?
Right.
Is it building your character?
It's not a question I ask.
Yeah, no. But it's one of those things that's how God looks at it. God looks at this like, yes, suffering is a part of things. And, when you look at Joseph, he had a rough life. He was sold into slavery by his brothers. That's gotta be tough.
Yeah.
Then he goes and gets a little bit better, and then he gets accused of rape by Potiphar's wife. And he gets thrown in jail unjustly, and then he's helping people with dreams, and they forget about him for a very long time. But after all of that struggle, he gets to this place where he's saving a country and saving his family.
Yeah.
And in front of his family, he says that God takes what was meant for evil and makes it good. So he has a different picture of things. So we really have to look differently. That mental illness falls into that different picture of things.
Yeah.
It's a part of suffering that we will experience, but it needs to be something that as we deal with it, we use it to build perseverance and character and find hope. It takes me back to Psalm 34:18, says, "The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit."
It's a good word.
Yeah, I love that verse. I think something that's talked about maybe even less than mental illness and the struggles that come along with that is how to be a friend to those who are struggling with it. I think that that's a topic that's equally as important to talk about whenever you're addressing mental illness. I think it's important to remember that Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane did bring his friends along with him. And I think that that should be an illustration for us to kind of copy that and to maybe not act exactly as his disciples did in that garden, but to actually be a friend and an empathetic listening ear and not necessarily to try and solve problems, just because I think we can all agree that trying to solve someone else's problems isn't the best way to handle things, but just listening, and I think sometimes that can be the most helpful thing. Kind of going off of that, I know you do a lot of listening, Pastor Trey. Why did you decide to be a counselor in church?
Good question.
I love that question. One of the things that I noticed, I was a counselor outside of the church for a long time, but I was a good Christian all along the way. And one of the things that I kept figuring out is that there are parts of us. There's the biological parts of us, our body. There's the psychological parts of us, our mind and our feelings. There's the social parts of us that interact with everybody. But the spiritual part is not just another part. It's not part 4. It's a part that weaves itself through all of those 3. Yeah. And so how can you work on any of those 3 without dealing with the part that weaves itself through all of it? So you've got the spiritual aspect, and I believe that you can't take that away when you're helping people, because then you're not helping all of them. And so one of the big things is that when we help other people, it builds this understanding of ourselves that helps us take away things that get in the way of our relationship with God. So I want to help people take those things that are between them and God away, so that it can really help them grow closer to God and have a more fruitful relationship with Him.
Heck yeah, that's awesome. Well, hey, Trey, thank you so much for joining us today and really talking about this topic with us. It's such an important thing that we're seeing, we're noticing. I mean, COVID has made that worse, as we've been told, like, hey, stay at home, isolate, be away. But man, God doesn't want us to be alone in this. And that's why even we here at the Grove have a counseling center with over 40 counselors that are ready to help our people and this community work through those things, take away those barriers that are stopping them from having a full relationship with the Lord. And so if you are a person that might want some help with counseling, I go to counseling every once in a while to work through things when I don't know what to do with some of the thoughts that I have. I hope that you won't feel some of these weird stigmas. We try our best to take those away. But if you want that help, we've got a counseling center. You can go ahead and call the number shown on the screen, and we'll be glad. The church will do whatever it takes to help get you the help that you need in this area. So make sure you take advantage of that. If you just need prayer, you're going through some things, you need prayer, you can email me at dreynolds@thegrove.cc, or even email our prayer hotline at prayer@thegrove.cc too. Church, we love you guys. We're so glad you decided to join us this week. I'm going to pray and we'll close out. Father, thank you for this opportunity to be together and to go through these topics. Lord, I do pray that you would put it on our students' hearts that are hearing this today and might need some extra help, that might just need some help walking through some of these thoughts, these feelings, these things that they're struggling with. And I pray that they wouldn't feel alone in it, that they would know that your son Jesus experienced every single struggle that we've experienced and overcame them, and that victory that he has, we can now share because of the Spirit that lives inside of us. So Lord, I do pray that Spirit living inside these believers, Lord, that it would urge them to get the help that they need in this time. We love you, Jesus, so much, and we pray, amen. We'll see you guys next week.